Good morning. I don't know about you, but I need to start with prayer. Good and loving God, the story of your love for us in Christ Jesus our Lord warms our hearts and animates our spirits. We give thanks for the story. May our lives become stories of your love for us. And in some small way, may the workshop we will now enjoy contribute to that process. We pray through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Now, I figured that if anybody shows up at a preaching workshop like this on storytelling, I don't need to persuade you of the value of storytelling, but I do want to make a couple of preliminary observations before we get down to business. And the first of the observations is that in the Gospels, Jesus is accused of being, to quote the King James Version of the Bible, a glutton and a wine-bibber. Now, a more contemporary translation of the Greek behind that description would probably be a real party animal. And you know, the fact of the matter is, particularly in the Gospel of Luke, there's some evidence for it. You can really see why they would make that accusation against Jesus. Oh, he's a real party animal. He likes eating and drinking because, especially in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is always being invited to dinner. That's the way it works out. Now, why did they invite Jesus to dinner? Well, it wasn't because of the charm of the disciples. Why, Peter and James and John still probably had fish scales under their fingernails. And the only one who really was at all impressive was probably that Judas character. He was the one who seemed to have his feet on the ground. But the rest of them, my dear, they didn't invite Jesus because of the charm of his disciples. Here's a guess. Jesus told really good stories. I mean, why else would you invite this man to dinner? He told really good stories. If you ever are tempted to downplay the importance of storytelling in communication in general and in preaching in particular, remember that Jesus told really good stories. The second observation I want to make is that you can say about stories what ancient scholars said about rhetoric in general, rhetoric being the most important of the public arts of the ancient world. One of the great teachers of rhetoric, who became a teacher of theology, St. Augustine of Hippo, who wrote the first textbook on speaking and preaching in general, quoted perhaps the greatest speaker of the ancient world, Cicero, very roughly to say that there are three functions of rhetoric, and these three functions also apply in preaching, and they are to delight, to teach, and to persuade. To delight, to teach, and to persuade. And I think that our stories need to do at least two of them. It is quite possible and entirely valid to tell stories simply because they do delight. People like listening to stories. And a little bit of an aside, you can do a workshop on storytelling in a setting like this, in a sanctuary, without anything really in the nature of technology, because you don't need technology in order to tell a good story. All you need is a heart and a few good words, and you can tell a story. All of you possess those gifts, by the way. Well, delight is good enough. I'm not going to give examples of all three categories right now, but here's a story that I really enjoy and that has no particular spiritual application, though perhaps you can work on it at the end of the day. And okay, is that a little bit better? Over in front of my mouth a bit more? Okay, good idea. Thank you very much for telling me. I was preaching in a church in eastern Toronto back in the 90s when there were still lots of veterans of the World War II around, and one of the veterans came up to me in the social time after the service and said to me, "Stephen, I'm the luckiest man in Canada." His name was Ed, so I said, "Ed, why is that?" And he said, "Well, I went over with the Canadian Expeditionary Force in 1940, and pretty shortly thereafter, they diagnosed me with a bacterial abscess on my spine, and they couldn't heal it. And they told me that it would expand until it snapped my spine, and I would die at that point, so there was nothing they could do. They sent me home to a hospital in Winnipeg to live out my last few days, and so he did. And one day, late in the war, the doctor in charge of the hospital called him in and said, "Ed, they've sent us a new batch of medicine from Britain. They sent 3 batches to Canada, 1 to Winnipeg, 1 to Vancouver, 1 to Montreal, and we don't know what it will do. But we'd like to try it out on you. And I'll be really honest with you, the reason that we'd like to try it out on you is that, well, you're going to die anyways, and it can't do you any harm." Well, Ed thought about it, he said, and he decided, might as well. So the doctor said, "No time like the present. It has to be injected into the buttocks. So drop your trousers and lean over my desk." And a beautiful blonde nurse came in with a syringe, which Ed said in his memory was about the size of a horse syringe, and stuck it in his buttocks. And you've probably guessed what it was. It was one of the very first uses of penicillin in Canada. And in a bacteria population unused to antibiotics, unlike our present day, it worked like magic, and he was healed. So I said, "Ed, yeah, that's a wonderful story. You really are the luckiest man in Canada." And he paused and leaned over and said, "Not only that, I married the nurse." Okay, it's a good story. I think it delights. Doesn't have any particular spiritual insight or validity or anything like that, as far as I can tell, though maybe we could work at it and find something. But it's worth telling that story for the simple reason that it delights. But to give one very at-home example, if I did nothing but that for the next hour, you would feel that I had wasted your time, because the stories that we speak in church, they indeed ought to delight. But they also ought to either teach or to persuade. St. Augustine was right. Our stories should delight, but they should also teach and persuade. Now, the subject of today's workshop is the 5 skills of the storyteller. And being able to tell a good story is not enough. The ability to tell a tale in a winning manner is one of at least 5 different skills for the storyteller. Now, let me tell you what is not among those 5 storytellers, and that is making up stories. There is a verbal report in the oral tradition about the great preacher Fred Craddock, who has preached here in York Minster Park, among other places in North America and around the world. Wonderful preacher, died a year or 2 ago. Fred Craddock used to say, if you don't have a story, make one up. After all, Jesus did. Well, that's probably good advice, except for the fact that most of us are not in the production side of storytelling. We're in the retell side of storytelling. That's our side of things. It's like jokes. How many of you have actually ever made up a joke? Well, congratulations. I've never actually met anybody who made up a joke. Well, congratulations to you. Most of us just hear a good one and pass it on, and that's exactly what we do with stories. The great Irish wit, Oscar Wilde once heard somebody say, say something extremely witty, and Wilde said, "Oh, I wish I'd said that." And one of his friends, knowing Oscar Wilde's character, said, "You will, Oscar, you will." Okay, that's what we do with stories in church for the main part. I once tried as an exercise to write a parable. Professors of New Testament are always saying about parables, it arose in the community. That's absolute nonsense, by the way, and only comes from people who've never actually tried to write a parable. They're extremely difficult to tell, extremely difficult to compose. Somebody of real spiritual insight and skill with words is required actually to compose a good parable. And by and large, let this be to your relief. You don't have to compose your own stories. You don't have to do that. What you actually do, and this is the first of the skills, is recognize a potential story. Okay. Well, let's think about that for a minute. We're actually going to work through the process in a few minutes with another story, but here are two different ones, one of which happened on the way to Yorkminster Park here this morning. Okay, here's number one. This is the kind of thing that can get turned into a story. I was at a conference in São Paulo, Brazil. It was in the Central Presbyterian Church in that huge city of maybe 28 million. They're not quite sure what the population actually is, as is the case in many Latin American cities. Outside the church, there was a little bit of an arcade, and in that arcade, as I walked in, there was a man lying on the ground, fast asleep, and he had a very weather-worn face and very rough clothing, and it was easy enough to tell the story behind it. This was a street person, probably with an alcohol or a drug program. Nothing unusual about that. You'd see that in Toronto, too, very easily. What was unusual was that by his head, at the door of the church, was a white napkin, and on the napkin was 5 small loaves, 5 rolls. Okay, let's just leave it there for a minute. I'm going to ask you to work with that in a little bit. Turn that into a story that you could use in church, using the skills we want to talk about. But the first thing is actually to see the thing that is right in front of you. Recognizing the potential of a story in an observation of something around you is the first and arguably the most important of all the skills of the storyteller. And if you don't have this one, you'll probably end up borrowing from the internet. And a lot of them, well, let's leave that out for now. Okay. So recognizing the story. Okay, here's another one. Lest you think, well, this guy, he went off to Brazil. You go off to Brazil, of course you're going to have interesting things happen to you. This happened in Etobicoke. It's not Brazil. We were driving on our way here from Etobicoke, driving along Lakeshore Boulevard. We intended to make a left-hand turn at Parkside. And there's a long left-hand turn on Lakeshore Boulevard, and beside it, a quite wide green boulevard. So it's kind of a lovely road, in all honesty. And we got into the line up in the left-hand turn lane, and I could see ahead of us the back of a man walking his dog. Nothing particularly unusual about it. He looked pretty normal for a dog walker, and he had a small and very active dog, and he was reaching down and playing with the dog and scratching behind the ears, and the kind of things that a dog owner does with a pet. And then he turned around and started walking back. And as he walked back, he held up a sign on cardboard which said, "Anything will help." And I knew what he was doing. We all do in Toronto or any of the other cities around. He was panhandling, asking for money from the people in the cars waiting to turn left. Anything will help. But interestingly enough, as he went by, he didn't do what I think a panhandler needs to do. He didn't catch our eye. He was playing with the dog, walking by. And I didn't see anybody get any money. I didn't see anybody give any money. And I don't know about you, but I always feel relieved when the light changes and you can drive on by on the other side. Okay? There's something there. I haven't worked it out yet. Maybe you can help me with that this morning. But the first of the skills of the storyteller is recognition. We have to recognize what's in front of us when we're living. Because this is where you get the good stories from. This is where you get the real stories from, not from the internet. So, skill number 2. Skill number 2 is knowing, or I could use the word recognizing again, when and when not to tell a story. Okay. Now, it's entirely possible that we shouldn't use particular stories. Delete is the right response to many of the stories that come. I remember a particular student who preached a sermon in my hearing, which had a big central story in it about a climber on Mount Washington in New England. And Mount Washington is one of the coldest mountains in the United States, and apparently it's quite high, but it has a broad summit on it. And somewhere in the broad summit, there's a shelter for climbers. And this particular climber climbed Mount Washington in the winter in a snowstorm, and he wandered around on this broad summit, never finding the shelter, and eventually he died. And that was the central metaphor of the sermon. And by the way, it fit beautifully, because that's what happened to the sermon too. It's not uncommon. Sermons wander around until they die. You all know that. And it's a pretty dreadful feeling listening to it. It's an even worse feeling when you're in the pulpit watching it happen. It's probably happened to you as it's happened to me. Well, you know, I suppose that a really, really brilliant preacher could make something out of that. Most of the rest of us would be wise just to plain leave it out. And certainly, we would be well advised to leave out another thing that the same student, I am reliably informed, I didn't actually hear this, but I'm very reliably informed that this happened. He told a children's story about the good things that Hitler did. I mean, it was somewhat puzzling to the 4- and 5-year-olds sitting around him at the front of the church. I mean, maybe you could get something out of a story about a traveler wandering around on top of Mount Washington, but the good things that Hitler did?
Was he looking for a job the next day?
Well, apparently his supervisor, who's a friend of mine from whom I heard the story, took him aside and said, important learning point here, never tell about Hitler in a children's story. No, he became a minister. So, yeah. Retired. Retired. You know about retired deans, which is what we don't actually retire, we just lose our faculties. Ooh, sorry. Bad. Did I mention in this workshop that you shouldn't tell jokes in sermons? Actually, you shouldn't normally. That is true. Okay. So it may well be that not telling a story is the right answer. And that may be the case with the one that I want to work with this morning, and I'll tell you the observation right now. And this happened in the Toronto subway system before I moved out to Vancouver. And at that time in the TTC, and it may still be to this case, there is a particular seat in a subway car that is perpendicular to the car. It sticks out into the middle of the car. And if you're my size, with my need for leg room, the best seat that you can get in the subway is on the end of that perpendicular seat, because your legs can actually extend a little bit. It's the most comfortable and best seat, and one day I actually got that seat. Well, it also means as the car fills up that there are lots of people very, very close to you. And a young man came up next to me, and he was a very small young man. He was, in fact, about the same height standing as I am sitting. And he was very finely boned. He was trying to grow a mustache, a little auburn mustache, but in truth it was very, very wispy. And he had Coke bottle bottom glasses, wire rimmed glasses, very, very thick. And he was standing there reading a book, and because of our relative heights, the book was right in my face. And I could see the title. And the title was Winning Through Intimidation. Now, why would you recognize that as a potential sermon? It's because of the incongruity. Because of the incongruity. You know, like it or not, size matters in intimidation. There actually was, sponsored by the government, a study that came to the startling conclusion about bullying that bullies tended to be a bit bigger than other children. I mean, how many of you could have told the investigators that from your childhood? You knew that, right? I wasn't a bully, in all honesty. But nobody bullied me either, because I was the biggest child in my school. Okay? So the basis of this is that there's an incongruity there. But there's also a real problem there. Now, you very graciously laughed and so on, which actually wasn't my aim, because I'll tell you why in a minute. I was actually quite sad when I looked at this. But there's a real potential problem here. What might be the problem with telling that story, particularly for me? It sounds like I'm making fun of small people, and it sounds like I'm making fun of him. And to a degree, I have to do that to name the incongruity. You have to name the incongruity. If he were 6'7", 300 pounds, and had Hell's Angels tattoos, it wouldn't be incongruous because he's as intimidating as hell, just as it is. But for maybe a 5'4" man, 120 pounds with glasses, that's a problem. And it's a real problem if somebody my size seems to be making fun of that man. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder too if it isn't the subject matter, intimidation, which isn't a subject you necessarily be preaching about. So you'd have to find a way to turn that around.
Okay.
If you had the Hell's Angel guy reading a book about, how to be warmer and fuzzy or something, that's an incongruity.
Yep.
That would work,
That would be an incongruity that would work. It would be an entirely different story, of course, but you've hit it right on. What you're looking for in the recognition is to see some kind of incongruity. And all I can say is, in the things that you see around you, if you can recognize a potential incongruity, the odds are pretty good that you will be able to use that in your storytelling. But it's also very important to recognize the problems, the dangers, and it may well be that the best thing for me with respect to that story about the little man and winning through intimidation is don't use it. That may be the right judgment. It is entirely possible the best thing to do with an observation is to delete it. Don't use it. Yes, ma'am.
But I found the tone of voice that you used in conveying the situation
Yeah.
You were carefully approaching it and let the incongruity be itself.
Uh-huh.
It's there to recognize. I didn't feel like you were using the incongruity to bully him,
Yeah.
which then I would delete.
The tone was empathetic.
But the tone was empathetic.
You're absolutely right.
Possibility for us to talk about bullying.
You're absolutely right. And the stuff I'm talking about today is basically a chapter in a book that Whiff and Stock will publish in the next couple of months. Okay? And I was writing about this, and exactly what you said. This group is way ahead. Exactly what you said, I had to write in, because when you write something, none of that tone of voice, facial expression, body language, all those things which are hugely important in communication of any sort, let alone storytelling, they don't appear on the page. And especially a reader might have thought, here's this guy making fun of some small man, which in all honesty I'm not.
And yet I felt guilty after I laughed.
Yeah. Well,
In spite of how, in spite of how you told the story, I felt guilty that we all laughed.
well, and I feel slightly guilty telling it. I need to tell you I can't tell you one of those obvious ones and make the point that sometimes the best answer is leave it out. It's really important. Little bit of an aside, and I'll pick this up a little bit later. You'll hear a lot of good stories this weekend. Don't automatically tell all of them next Sunday. Please. We'll talk about that a little bit later. It may be that leaving out the story is the best response and the most Christian response that you can give. Now, actually, the truth of the matter is, I felt extremely sorry for the man. Because looking at him, I guessed, and I remain 100% morally certain about this, he was reading that book because he'd been intimidated. He'd spent most of his life being intimidated. And that must be just awful. So I was sad. Sure, it's funny. And please don't feel very guilty about laughing. Most humor in the world involves pain of some sort. Bob Hope, this is an aside, once said, "There's no humor in heaven." And by that, he didn't mean that everybody in heaven's all grim all the time. It was that this great comedian recognized that most humor, even if it's as simple as slipping on a banana peel, rests on pain of some sort. Okay. The background to the gospel is pain. If we leave everything out because it might be painful to us or to our listeners, we'll be mute. We really will be. Okay. So it may well be that the best thing is to leave it out, but at least file it away so that there may come a time where that's potentially useful. And that leads us to our third story, our third skill, which is the obvious one and which is the one I don't want to talk about very much, and that's actually telling the story. We may get around to this again. But the best advice that I can give you about learning to be a good storyteller is to engage in intensive study of the Vinyl Cafe or the Prairie Home Companion. Listen to Garrison Keillor or Stuart McLean. What a loss Stuart McLean was. Yeah, what a terrible loss Stuart McLean was. You learn to be a good storyteller by listening to good storytellers and then trying it out yourself. And I may or may, depending on the time, may or may not be able to say a few more specific things about that. But simply listening to stories, including the ones that I tell to some degree, you may learn more than anything that you can get in a workshop. If I had tons of time, if I had 2 days rather than an hour to do this, I think that I would actually probably play for you The Lutherans by Garrison Keillor. Anybody know that story? Yeah. Wouldn't that be worth listening to? Wouldn't that teach you more about good storytelling than anything some presenter can tell you? Well, let's skip over that one and move to skill number 4. And the only thing I'm going to do is write telling. And let's flip this over to 4. And skill number 4 is linking. Linking the story to the text and to the rest of the sermon. And this is probably more important than actually telling the story itself. The best storytelling preacher in the more or less contemporary North American church was indeed, in my opinion, Fred Craddock. And a group of his friends actually produced a book of his stories. And in all honesty, the book is a little bit dull. You may know it and you may love it, but to me it's a little bit dull, because what was really amazing about Fred Craddock was not the particular stories themselves, but the way he would use them, the way he would fit them in, the way he would make them link to the text and link to the development of the sermon. And that's a really, really important skill. I mentioned that this is part of a book that I'm writing. Just at this point in the book, I made an error that I didn't catch until the 5th edit. And it was calling that story that I just told you about, the man in the subway, I called it not winning through intimidation, but winning through interpretation. And of course, the spell checker didn't catch it because I'd spelled it properly, and it made sense. I think it's one of those Freudian mistakes that actually speaks the truth. How do good preachers and good storytellers and effective teachers really do it? It's usually through interpretation. Now, I need to tell you that in some cases this is an unpopular opinion, that you should leave a story as it is, that you shouldn't interpret, and that its ambiguity is what gives it strength. Well, I don't believe that to be true. The result of that very often is not ambiguity, but confusion. I mean, you have to know what to be ambiguous about, for heaven's sakes, before it actually works. Okay, a very, very ancient story. Appointment in Samarra. There was a man who lived in the city of Baghdad. And one morning he walked towards the great central market of Baghdad, and as he approached the market, he saw a friend of his running in great fear and anxiety, and he stopped the man and said, "Why are you so afraid?" And the man said, "Oh, I just saw death in the marketplace, and death made a threatening gesture towards me. But if you lend me your horse, your fastest horse, please, I'll ride to Samarra, and surely death will not find me there." So the man, troubled by his friend's anxiety and fear, lent him his horse, and he rode off in the direction of Samarra. And then the man continued on his way to the marketplace, and sure enough, there was death standing in the middle of the marketplace. And greatly daring, the man went up to death and said, "Why did you make a threatening gesture towards my friend?" And death said, "I did not make a threatening gesture. It was a start of surprise, for I did not expect to see him here, for I have an appointment with him tomorrow in Samarra." Okay. Why do you tell that story? Well, it's about the certainty of death and the folly of trying to pretend that death is not there, which we do in our society all the time. If you want to know what a society is uncomfortable with, look at the words with a plentiful supply of euphemisms. You know, it used to be sex. Not anymore. What is it now? It's death. How many euphemisms are there for death? You know, have you ever noticed in a traditional Ontario death notice, which isn't a death notice, it's an obituary? Who knows what the word obituary even means? In the traditional death notice, there actually isn't a verb. It says, suddenly, or after a long struggle, or after a brave attempt to resist cancer, or something like that. Suddenly what? Couldn't stand the winters around here and moved to Florida? Okay. If a society uses euphemisms, they're afraid to talk about the thing itself. And we pretend that death isn't there. But we all have an appointment in fill in the blank. It helps if your place starts with S, doesn't it? We all have an appointment in Scarborough, where I used to live. Okay. You do have to interpret it, and you have to have the right text to use it for, which will lead into the next of the skills, by the way. So, for example, it is appointed to us once to die, and after that, the judgment. Now, it would be a dreadful thing to interpret it before you tell the story. I want to tell you a story about the great truth that death is inevitable and it's etc. That'd be a stupid thing to do. But I do think interpretation, linking, how to fit that in. Okay, now let's go back to the man in the subway. Some thoughts about a text that this would actually link with appropriately. Any guesses? That's actually the one I used. You're much too good. That's actually the one I used. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. That is the one I preached on, as a matter of fact. So it was in this church. Were you here? No.
You could link it to the story of Zacchaeus.
Zacchaeus, the little man up in the tree? Mm-hmm. And he needed something, didn't he?
That's right. He was probably intimidated.
Anything will help. Yeah. He might have been intimidated. Don't excuse Zacchaeus too much, by the way. Why did they hate him? Because they took my taxes and my daughter died because we didn't have enough money to get the medicine. Okay.
I might use the story of the children, Jesus saying, unless you become like one of these, you can't inherit the kingdom. But I talk about little people.
Uh-huh.
Expand the image of children to be little people who have no power.
People without power.
Yeah.
Okay. And indeed, this person was a little person, I think, in that sense of the word, too. Any other suggestions before we pass on?
Judas Iscariot.
Judas Iscariot. Now, that's interesting. Tell me why.
I would have to play with it a bit.
Uh-huh.
The whole idea that Judas used betrayal as an intimidation technique.
Mm-hmm.
There's all kinds of ways you could go with that. I don't know if I'd use it. But
Yeah. Okay. But some very important things to say there. I'd have to play with it, and I don't know if I would use it. Both those are very important sentences. When these observations, these stories come to us, not ready-made out of the internet, but out of our lived experience, what you're saying is exactly right. I don't know what to do with it. I would have to play with it. And it doesn't strike me immediately, but if you played with it for a while, maybe something important would link. Maybe not, in which case your other observation becomes important. I wouldn't use it for that purpose. Yes, ma'am?
Palm Sunday
Palm Sunday?
to mind
Uh-huh.
in terms of narrowing the
Uh-huh. Okay. Yeah. Once again, you'd have to play with it some more. So you don't know, do you? You don't know ahead of time. In fact, you nailed it first time. That is how I used it. That I told the story. I said I felt like challenging him, but I didn't, because I thought I might scare him, which was true. Under other circumstances, I would have spoken to him about it. But some big stranger telling him that's not a good book to read, that's intimidating. And this is what I thought, that he was intimidated himself, and that he would be better off reading the Gospel of Matthew, because the meek may not win, but according to Jesus, they'll inherit the earth. We don't know his story. I'm just guessing. Yeah. And when I tell the story, I have to say, I'm guessing. Now, I think it's a reasonable guess, mind you, but I do have to say, thank you for that intervention. I do have to say, I am guessing. I do not know his backstory. But it is the gospel, after all, that it's better to listen to Jesus than to win by being a bully. And the worst result, by the way, would not be that he would fail in his attempt to win through intimidation. The worst thing would be if he succeeded. Still, is it? He becomes the bully. And he isn't one of the meek who inherits the earth. So read the Gospel of Matthew and listen to Jesus. Okay? What makes the story is usually, and Fred Craddock was marvelous at this, what makes the story is in fact the interpretation. It's the link. And figuring that skill out is skill number 4, and it is arguably the most important of the 4 of them. It really is. Okay, number 5. Well, we've already hinted at it. Okay. You don't know when you hear a story what text it should link to. You don't know what theme it can appropriately develop. I'll tell you one text that it probably shouldn't apply to, and that's next Sunday's. I mentioned this a couple of minutes ago. Please don't take the stories that you hear, either in this workshop or from some of the marvelous preachers and teachers that are here in the Lester Randall lineup, and make sure that you stick it into next Sunday's sermon with a homiletical crowbar. You know what'll happen. People remember the story and they'll completely forget whatever it is you want to preach about. To quote a phrase that the homiletician David Buttrick used to use regularly, it'll blow away the surrounding material. Now, it's not the case that you should avoid stories because they may blow away the surrounding material. I mean, can you imagine somebody coming up to the evangelist Luke and saying, "Luke, it was a bad mistake putting in that story about the Good Samaritan. It'll blow away the rest of the chapter." I mean, who remembers the rest of chapter 10? No. Saying that a story will blow it away is partly testimony to the reality that stories actually are very effective forms of communication. But it has to pull in the same direction as the Bible text. It has to enlighten and broaden and extend into our day the Bible text. And this is an extremely important aside. Storytelling does not replace good exegesis. The story that really matters is not any of the little stories that we tell, but the story of creation, the story of the choice of Abraham and of Sarah, the story of the prophets, the Exodus and the exile, the story of Jesus and of the early church in the book of Acts, all that. That's the story that really matters. And our stories, the ones that we tell and the ones that we live out, they're like the small gems that reflect the central gem in the jewel of the gospel. That's what we're really looking for. Now, so what are you going to do about it? Well, I'll tell you one thing. If you don't do anything about it, you're going to forget it. In 2 weeks, you're going to forget it. So the fifth skill is creating, let me use computer language, creating a database of stories. Okay. So that 6 months later, when the right text comes up, when in the lectionary, for example, you actually turn around to the Beatitudes and you're reading Blessed are the meek, or whatever text that you do decide this story fits into, then you have that story and you can pull it out and you can find it and you have it to use. I spent a pastoral experience year when I was a student in the hills of West Virginia, in Montgomery, West Virginia. My supervisor was Dr. Dean Thompson, who was a wonderful, wonderful minister. And he took me aside one day and sat me down in his study, and he showed me how once a quarter he would go through a great pile of magazines and newspapers, and he would physically clip out and put in file folders that he labeled quotations, stories, some pictures, all that kind of stuff. He'd put them in physical manila brown files. Now, we don't do that anymore, do we? We wouldn't do, well, you still do? Well, that's good. I admire your level of organization, and you must have a big office. You've got them on your computer. You know that's where I'm going. That's how we do it nowadays. And I think that that's something that you have to discipline yourself to do. Now, if you like these stories, buy the book when it comes out in 3 months. No. Yes, do that. But go home and type them up enough that you can remember what the story was about. You don't have to polish it. The polishing it will happen on Saturday night before you preach it, or whenever you actually give the final polish to your sermon. Okay? But go home, type it up. You liked Appointment in Samara. Type in Appointment in Samara, enough of the story that you remember the gist of it. It doesn't take that long. And then at some point, when death comes up in your text, and unless you do the equivalent of our society and willfully ignore death, it's there in a lot of texts in the Bible, isn't it? Okay. Next time you find one of those texts, why, that's what you're going to do. Okay? You're going to pull that out. So in my case, the database became the book in a large extent. But I have actually 2 files of stories and what I call a commonplace file. People used to keep commonplace books, and they were snippets of poetry, quotations, other things, wisely or wittily said things that people would collect in little books and think on those. I have that kind of file in my computer. So you need a computer, some kind of file. Word works just fine, or Pages, or whatever your computer uses. And you have to do a title and some subjects and maybe a Bible text or 2. So let's take our story about the young man in the subway. First of all, a title. What do you call it? Winning by intimidation, and that's exactly right. Okay, a couple of themes or subjects. Pardon me? Bullying. That could be one. Meek. Yep, that could be another. Just one more. Futility. Okay. All those three. You could put them at the top. Bible text. Well, this is if you can anticipate using a particular text. And so in my case, as I've already mentioned, I used this for a sermon on the Beatitudes, Matthew chapter 5, I think it's verse 9, and so I put that in. So I was winning through intimidation and meek, and the Beatitudes and Matthew 5, 9, and then I wrote the story in and used it, and I think I got the laugh, but I wasn't really preaching for the laugh. A little bit of an aside. One of the wonderful things about laughter is that it puts people off guard. And once again, Fred Craddock was brilliant at this. You tell a story that's funnily phrased or something like that, they laugh, and then you turn it a quarter turn. And people feel it deeply and sadly in our heart. Because once again, humor is close to sorrow. Because both humor and sorrow, in the end, rest on pain. So there's your five skills. And the fifth one, you have to discipline yourself too. It doesn't really begin to pay dividends. The investment doesn't come off for several years. But when it does come off, it's extremely useful. It is a good long-term investment of your time. It's actually worth it. Okay, so let's take a look very quickly at those two stories that I told you. Okay, now, the story of the man in Brazil. The street person lying there outside the church in the arcade, sound asleep, sleeping it off would be my guess, pretty confident guess, and a white linen napkin at his head against the hour in which he should awake, and 5 rolls, 5 small loaves. Now, I will say that recognition in some cases needs to be extended, and this is one of them. If you can find out anything about the backstory, then yes, by all means do that. So I asked about the man. The minister of the church that was hosting us was on the committee. He was a friend of mine. I could speak to him, and I told him what I'd seen, and he said, yes, he came from a wealthy family, and he was well educated. He'd earned a master's degree. He'd learned to speak 5 languages, but he had lost his life in the bottom of the bottle. And that the church tried to help him out, but he felt so ashamed of what he'd done with his life that he would never even come into the church. But he would sometimes do small jobs around the church to earn a little bit of money, including cleaning up the premises for the visit of our committee. But he'd never come into the church. But the church reached out to him. Okay, let's talk about that. And we don't have much time at all. But let's use that as a little bit of an exercise. What could we possibly do with that? What are some of your first thoughts? And remember, rightly, you have to play with it.
Well, just the fact that there were 5 bowls makes me think of the 5 loaves and the fish. And that instead of feeding a multitude, feeding an individual.
Yeah.
Play with that a little bit.
Yeah. The 5 loaves, what was said is that the fact there are 5 rolls reminds of the story. The one miracle in all 4 Gospels, by the way, the feeding of the 5,000. And by the way, the disciples think it's in the Gospel of John, Philip in particular, think that it's useless, don't they? I mean, what is this compared to so many? Andrew says that. And send them away. After all, that's the only realistic thing to do. You can't do a thing. I mean, there are 28 million people in Sao Paulo, a lot of them desperately poor. Here's a guy who's wasted his life in the bottle. You know, what's the use? What's the use? Why not just give up? Sir? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He wasn't good enough to come into church. He'd messed up his life and he was just too deeply shamed.
But then I think it's our responsibility to not send that message.
Uh-huh.
Because I think a lot of people feel that way because that's the message we send someone.
Yeah. Yeah. Boy, these things are worth thinking about, aren't they? And sometimes a story provokes thoughts that you don't really expect, and that's absolutely right.
But you could link that with the text of the Pharisee and the sinner. You know, the Pharisee comes in and prays, "How wonderful I am! I've done all these good things, and I'm not like this sinner." And then the man who is a sinner beats his breast and says, "Lord, I'm a sinner,"
Mm-hmm.
who is accepted,
Mm-hmm.
not the Pharisee. So use that, maybe link it to that text.
It could well fit. And so in our 5 skills that we were talking about, you know, you might put shame as one of them. You might put the Pharisee and the publican as the other. You might, well, as I myself did, want to link it because of the 5 loaves to the fish. I meant to bring the photo, by the way, but we moved in the summer and I can't find it. I actually have a photo of this. And just as an aside, this is one of the very few times where a person has challenged my veracity after a sermon. And he said, "You know that story about the 5 loaves? That didn't really happen, did it?" And oddly enough, it is the one story of which I have a photograph, or used to have a photograph. I wish I could have shown the guy. Okay, so there are a lot of different possibilities. And right now, sitting here, you don't know. That's why why this 5th skill is pretty darn important in my view, and why that linking skill is absolutely vital. Sir? I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Maybe the story is not about the man, but about the loaves of bread.
Yeah?
How they arrived, who prepared them.
Yeah. And it might make a very good Communion Sunday sermon. Because, I tried to use the little detail, and the details are important. I tried to use the little detail of the linen napkin set before him against the hour in which he should awake. All possibilities. Sorry. Well, those are a wide variety of the possibilities that could be used. Now, there's a bit more to the story. And this, by the way, is one of the possible skills of the storyteller. Don't tell the whole story at first. Tell part of the story, make it look as if the story's over, and then bring it back. A year later, the same committee met elsewhere in the world, very far elsewhere. And the minister of the church in Brazil was, of course, at it again. And he took me aside and said, "Stephen, do you remember that man you spoke about? The man outside the church?" He said, "He died this year." I said, "Oh, that's too bad." And my friend said, yes, it is. But before he died, he let us bring him into the church. And he died in the church, surrounded by his friends. It's not 5,000 people. And I don't know about the way you think, but I would call that a miracle. And I might also call it the gospel. And the task goes on. I saw another man. And he had a dog whom he cared for very much. And he wouldn't look the people he was asking for help from in the eye. And he didn't get any help. But he carried a cardboard sign saying, "Anything will help." He isn't in São Paulo. He's in Toronto. What will we do? We're starting the next section in 6 minutes. But I would say we can use one of those minutes, maybe 2 of those minutes, for any questions or comments or complaints that you may have. Not that I'll listen to the last ones, of course. Mm-hmm.
Often when I hear someone's story, I think of a story similar
Mm-hmm.
that I experienced.
Yes.
And then I use that story that I experienced.
Yes, and that is something that happens. Thank you for mentioning that. If you hear a good story, very often the internal response is, "Oh, that's just like," and the story that is provoked by the first story is actually the one to use in the sermon. Very well said.
I can't remember
I can't remember if I was actually taught this or if I just, it's an internal instinct, but I'm always hesitant to tell my own, like, a story from my own life
Yeah.
in a sermon. It's not because I'm not shy or not to tell a story about myself, but I feel like I don't want a sermon to become about me.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just comment on that?
Yeah, I think that.
Of telling a story, like I've done it, but it's very sparingly and only when it really is going to serve a pastoral function, like in the sermon.
I think that's very wise. I think that our own experience is like a powerful medicine. And you know, the easiest thing to do with powerful medicine is to overdose. And it's dangerous. It's, among other things, it's probably addictive. So it's dangerous for the listeners and maybe even more dangerous for the storyteller.
Yeah, I don't want to be the sermon to start. I don't want, if I'm telling a story and it's a story where I've experienced pain or suffering, I don't want my parishioners who love me to start spending the sermon time thinking about poor Erin and how that affected her and miss the story.
I think that that's right. And by the way, it's one of the reasons that David Buttrick was reluctant to tell stories, and especially not first-person stories, because he said they introduce a split in consciousness. That is, you're thinking about whatever the subject of the sermon is, whatever you want to get across, and also, oh, that poor woman, that was dreadful. I feel really sad about her. You don't want to get them stuck there. Now, another saying from another great preacher, Elizabeth Ochtmeyer, was that in the end, all sermons must have an element of testimony. In the end, a preacher has to be able to say about God, God has saved my eyes from tear and my feet from falling. So there has to be some, but boy, is it easy to overdo it. So think of really strong medicine. It's easy to become addicted. It's easy to overdose. And by the look of things, our session is now over, and I thank you very much.